Greetings in the name of the Lord. I hope this finds you doing well. As always, I hope and pray God's grace and peace is upon you richly at this hour, wherever you are and whomever you may be. My name is, as most of you know, Tyler, and I'll explain why here in a moment. I'm using the Dr. Seuss motif here, the cat in the hat thing. As you know, Dr. Seuss has very suddenly become a controversial figure in our culture for reasons I'm not going to explain right now, but those of you who may be watching from way off in the future or in different places, in other places around the world may wonder why in the world Dr. Seuss would be controversial, but I'll let you research that. But we have some very good news, and I wanted to take a couple of minutes here at the beginning of class to talk about it. But the governor of Arkansas just yesterday, I believe it was, yesterday, signed into law a ban on abortion. The state legislature passed, and the governor of Arkansas signed into law a bill that bans all abortion except in the case where the life of the mother is at risk. But I'm happy to say that in our culture, at this time in our culture, with the medical care that we have available to us, there is never a reason to kill a baby in her mother's womb just to save the life of the mother. It is never, let me reword that, it's never medically necessary to kill a baby in the womb to save the life of the mother. And that's the only exception in the bill. So in other words, it's virtually a ban on abortion, and little precious unborn babies everywhere are rejoicing in the news, as I'm sure you could imagine. It's a good day for the unborn. Now, of course, the law will be challenged in the courts. The ACLU and Planned Parenthood, the nation's leading killer of unborn children, have already denounced the bill and are challenging it in the courts. And so it will ultimately go, hopefully, to the Supreme Court. And of course, what pro-lifers are hoping, and all faithful Christians ought to be strong pro-lifers, but what pro-lifers are hoping is that when these laws are challenged, they'll come before the Supreme Court, and that ultimately one day we'll have a Supreme Court that will revisit the awful Roe versus Wade decision that legalized the murder of unborn children in the womb through all 9 months of pregnancy, and will overturn that abominable decision. I'm not sure the court as it's currently constituted will do that. I'm not sure the court as it stands now will have the courage and the conviction and the compassion for the unborn to reverse Roe, but we need to keep fighting toward that end, right? We need to keep working toward that end and standing for life and doing all we can to fight against these trends. And I want to explain to you now why I think it's interesting to bring up Dr. Seuss here, because there is a line in Dr. Seuss's "A Horton Hears a Who," I think it's called, right? Yes, that's what it is. And it's called, the line is, "A person's a person no matter how small." And whether Dr. Seuss intended it to be used that way, that expression has been adopted by the pro-life movement, and you'll often see it in memes and in graphics and on posters at pro-life protests and such. Because, of course, that's exactly what the Bible affirms, that your value as a human being is not determined by how large you are, by your stage of development, that you are a human being worthy of the protection of law, regardless of your stage of development or your location with reference to the womb or your degree of dependency on another human being, that every human life we need to affirm as God's people. We need to constantly be renewing our commitment to affirm the biblical sanctity, the biblical ethic on the sanctity of human life, and that all human life is valuable from conception to natural death, deserving of the protection of law. And we need to keep fighting for the unborn, and God bless those legislators and the governor of Arkansas for having the conviction to pass these laws. And let's be praying that one day the laws will actually be upheld, that one day the laws will actually be upheld in the high court instead of overturned. Okay, let me explain to you something about my recording the class right now, just to give you an idea of my state of mind here as we proceed. Now, I haven't been feeling well since Sunday afternoon, and I honestly wasn't sure if I was going to be able to record class at all. I kept chipping away at the material and working on the material and working on these boards. But look at the screen. This is what I see when I'm writing on the screen and recording. This is the basic template that I see. And you don't see all of these tools and all these other things here that I'm using, right? And when I want to see what slide I'm on or what slide to go to, I have all of this stuff here in front of me. And what happens is each slide has its own recording. So if I start a slide, or if I'm partway into a slide, and even if I'm finished with it and it took 5 or 10 minutes to do it, if I'm not happy with it, a lot of times I'll start it. I'll erase the audio from that slide and start over. And so what happened is I was just about done. I was mostly done recording the class, and I started a slide and I kind of choked a little bit. I had to clear my throat. And so I stopped, and I wanted to clear the recording and just for that slide, and then start again. And so you'll notice when I pull up that menu to do that, you see right here, I get this little option right there. And that little option asks me, remove recording. You want to remove the recording? Yeah, I want to remove the recording. But it asks you just from the current slide, or do you want to remove the recording from all the slides? And I've done it a million times, and I've always selected correctly. I've always been really careful just to make sure I hit on this right here, select only from the current slide. And for some reason, I reached down and I accidentally hit from all slides. And unlike almost every other feature like this on this program and every program available today, when you're going to do something that major to a document, there'll be a warning that pops up and says, now you sure you want to delete this or whatever? And there is no warning like that on here. And so I accidentally just was a little too careless when I went down to select this, and I deleted all of the recording that I had done up to that point, and it was impossible to rescue it. And so here I am now on my second time through trying to re-record the whole class for you. And I hope I don't sound too weary, because I am at this point. But all right, let's get to it. And the first thing I have to do is a correction from last time. That quote I tacked on after the piece to you, the final slide where I say goodbye, and then I had that quote that I told you I would include, that I would tack on to the end. And for some reason, when I always go back and check the video after it uploads, and for some reason this part didn't record properly, that some of the text is missing at the top, and then I caught a typo right here. So Miss Elaine, godly sister in Christ and a good friend who's always helping me out and pointing out when I have a typo of some sort. I want you to know I caught that right there, and I'll have that corrected for the file upload. But I just wanted you to have that quote. It's such a tremendous quote, and I wanted to make sure that you had the whole thing there for your reference. To set up something I want to include under literary features before we move on, I just want to point out again that some of the most beautiful and beloved statements in John's Gospel are in that section of his Gospel called the Farewell Discourse, where it's just Jesus with his disciples in the upper room, and Jesus talks at length to the disciples there. That's when we have the statement in chapter 13 about the commandment to love one another. Jesus says, as I have loved you, to love one another. That's chapter 13, 34, and 35. And then you get into chapter 14, and here's this well-known and often cited passage. Unfortunately, it seems that we typically only hear this verse at funerals, where Jesus said, let not your heart be troubled. Believe in God, believe also in me. In my Father's house are many rooms. He goes on to say, I'm going to prepare a place for you, and I will come again and take you to myself, that where I am, you may be also. Of course, that's in that farewell discourse. And then in verse 6, you have one of the great I am statements, where Jesus says, I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me, okay? Then at the end of chapter 14, Jesus says, peace I leave with you, my peace I give to you. Not as the world gives do I give to you. Let not your hearts be troubled, neither let them be afraid. You see how again and again Jesus is reassuring the disciples, knowing they're going to be overcome with sorrow when he is crucified in just a matter of hours. And here in chapter 16, verse 33, at the end, before Jesus then prays with the disciples, he says to take heart. In the world you have tribulation, but take heart. I have overcome the world. Tremendously important assurance that Jesus gives them and us there. And then in the prayer in John 17, the high priestly prayer, as it's often called, where Jesus prays that we would all be one. And he says that just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, that they may also be in us, so that the world may believe that you've sent me. We often cite that passage, and it is a beautiful, beautiful text. Well, all of that is in the farewell discourse. And I'm saying all that because I said we were going to leave literary features, but I just want to tack this on because this is an important literary feature of John's Gospel, a characteristic of this farewell discourse. When Jesus met with them in that upper room, and I want you to notice from this image, by the way, right here, I didn't notice it at first, but I like the way it shows right there. Judas is leaving, right? But there we find Jesus in the upper room talking at length to his disciples. And to put it in perspective in the book of John, I know this looks like a lot of detail here, but really it's just trying to show you the major elements of John's Gospel. Remember, just basically you have the two major divisions, the book of signs and the book of glory. But we have the amazing prologue, a tremendously significant literary feature and theological feature of John's Gospel, right? And then tacked on to the end, we have the epilogue, okay? So that gives you a good overview of the basic structure, and you see how much of John's Gospel, though, in the Book of Glory, when we come over here to the Book of Glory, that farewell discourse, chapters 13, 14, 15, 16, and then the prayer in chapter 17. And so there in that farewell discourse, this is what I wanted us to think about for a minute here, where Jesus then, and this is one artist's depiction of what finishes that whole encounter that he had with his disciples there when he prays for them. But there's something about it I want you to notice. We find that what we're learning about Jesus teaching to his disciples, and all of that teaching is reserved for this section of the book of John, is that we find it in a dialogical form. That is, there is this dialogue where the disciples are asking questions and Jesus is responding, and this is how the great truths of that section then are related to us, the way in which the material is presented. For example, Peter asks, well, where are you going in chapter 13? In chapter 14, Thomas says, well, how can we know the way after Jesus says you know the way? And later in verse 8, Philip says, well, show us the Father. And then Judas, John helpfully points out, not Iscariot, so we won't be confused. How will you manifest yourself to us but not the world? And then in chapter 16, they all say, oh, well, now you're speaking plainly. And so you see how this is the rhetorical form used to relate to us these tremendously important truths that we find in that farewell discourse. And that will become later typical of the Gnostic Gospels, the non-canonical Gospels that we hear so much about today that were written after the canonical Gospels. And the Gnostic Gospels will pick that up and imitate that. That's just a note for those of you who may be teachers and may be encountering that. And it is worth noting that this is a distinctive literary feature of John's Gospel. We don't find that in the Synoptics. So pay attention to that as well as you read that part of John. Okay, so we looked at the importance of John's Gospel, the historical context. We talked about the distinctiveness of John when we compare it to the Synoptics, and we said that was something we continued to look at then under the literary features, noticing how distinctive the literature of just the literary style of John is as well in comparison to the Synoptics. But now at long last we get to themes and theology. As you know, what I've been doing with the other classes is after literary features, we look at themes and theology, and then we finish with the Christology. And so at long last, we arrive at this point. Now, of course, we've been noting the major themes of John's Gospel, or many of them, as we've been looking at the literature of it. And we've already been introduced to a number of the important theological themes from what we've already looked at, but now we're going to set them out in a systematic way and comment on them. It seems to me that the place to start here is with the dualism of John's worldview. That is what it's sometimes referred to as the Johannine dualism, and you'll see what I mean by this here in a moment. But John presents his theology, much of his theology is presented in terms of these dichotomies that we'll notice. I'll list some for you here in a moment, but this is typically referred to as part of the Johannine worldview. And we all understand what a worldview is. It's the way that we look at the world. It's literally the way that we view reality. It really deals with the set of assumptions that we take to the world, and then the basic assumptions we are using on the basis of which we evaluate reality and ourselves and morality and all of that. And so everyone has a worldview, or a starting point or perspective from which they are viewing the world, and John is no exception. And the Johannine worldview, his emphasis is distinctive from what we find in the gospel. Not that it's mutually exclusive from the way the synoptics are approaching theology, but let's explain what we mean. But before that, let me just note that it's often argued that the Gospel of John was written late, and it certainly was written later than the other Gospels in my view, and in the view of most conservative scholars, around the end of the first century. But there are others who argue it was written well into the second century, and by then the Johannine community was thoroughly Hellenized, or it was influenced by Greek philosophy and culture. And some say these dualisms, these contrasts we find in John, that's just a reflection of Platonism or Plato and the Greek philosophy of Plato, and it was articulated by Cicero and others as we get to the time of Christ and after. But I do want to point out, for those of you who may be teachers and may be reading the scholarly material or the commentaries, that when people argue that the Johannine worldview is one that's immersed in Greek categories, just keep this in mind, that in answer to that, the fact is that even though there's some similarities with the Platonic dualistic ideas, still John's view of looking at the world, his way of looking at the world, is still decidedly Jewish. It is firmly embedded in the salvation history set out in Israel's scriptures, and that is a tremendously important distinction, despite what similarities there may be with Greek philosophy. See, it's often pointed out, well, John, he begins by calling Jesus the Word. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And so right there we see the influence of Greek philosophy on the Christian movement, from which John, or the writer of this gospel, emerged, or for which he was writing. But bear in mind that John's gospel is firmly rooted in Israel's worldview, where God is working through the people of Israel to bring Messiah into this world, to bring salvation to all men, and all of that that we're not going to articulate just here. But keep this in mind too, that John's dualism, unlike, say, the dualism that you would find later in Gnosticism, the Gnosticism, the nascent form of which John is clearly opposing in his gospel. It's not absolute in the sense that, for instance, you have darkness and light, but you can move from the darkness into the light, or Jesus comes into the darkness. He shines as a light in the darkness. He comes from above and comes below. He comes from above and takes on flesh and conquers death. And so it's not this same kind of absolutism that you find in the absolute dichotomies in every case that you find in Greek philosophy. I'm not just saying all that again for maybe the teachers and some of the preachers out there who are dealing with it on a little bit more a deeper or scholarly level. But if I give you some examples here, you'll see exactly what I'm talking about. These dichotomies we find in John are what I'm referring to here, like light and darkness, life and death. You see these contrasts that John uses over and over. From above versus below. Jesus keeps talking about how he is from above and we need to be born from above. And he contrasts himself with those who are below. Or the flesh and spirit. Remember when he was with Nicodemus and Jesus said, that which is flesh is flesh, and that which is spirit. And Jesus talks about how the flesh doesn't profit anything, the spirit is life in John 6 and verse 63. I didn't quote that verbatim, but there you find the contrast in his gospel. And in fact, now it's the it's the Spirit, he said, that gives light, the flesh life. The flesh profits nothing. And notice he mentions life. The words that I speak unto you, they are spirit and they are life. We'll see how these categories overlap, or the discussion of these categories is connected throughout his gospel. And the contrast between truth and falsehood. Remember, John uses that word true, the adjective true, and speaks of truth over and over. And it is contrasted with the lie, those who believe a lie, or who refuse to believe the truth. And this extends, of course, into, when we say the Johannine worldview, we mean what we find in the Gospel of John, but also in the letters of John, and also in the book of Revelation. I'm going to include the book of Revelation in the Johannine corpus, that it's also one of the works written by John. And so it's that outlook we see, that we find in John's gospel, and then it extends into and is often emphasized further and elaborated on further in the letters, and then even in the apocalypse. But you also find the love-hate contrast, and those who are of God are children of God, and those who are of the devil are children of the devil. Those who are, another way of saying the same thing, those who are of versus those who are not of the world. Those who believe versus those who will not believe. You notice how we said believe is a common term. We don't find the noun belief, but over and over in John's gospel we find the verb believe, to believe. And so believing, trusting, and accepting the truth from God is contrasted with those who will not receive Christ, who will not receive his words, his truth, who will not believe. They are of the devil. John 8:44, they're of the world, and so they hate the light and they won't come to the light. We'll see here in a moment. They hate those who are not of the world, because Jesus called them out of the world. So you see how these categories here are related and how they are brought together over and over in John's gospel. And in fact, the theology we encounter in his gospel is presented largely in terms of these contrasting pairs, and that might be the better way to say it, instead of dualisms or dichotomies. It might be better to think of them as contrasting pairs for the reasons that we said earlier. And we should bear in mind that they're repeated. We find them over and over again throughout the Johannine writings, and they're linked, they're woven together throughout the narrative, throughout John's gospel and the other Johannine texts. And so that's why we're going to look at them. And to go back to the prologue, for example, we already see right at the start of John's gospel that we're encountering these dualisms like life, you remember, life and light versus the darkness. And then John, as you go down a few verses later, let me slide this up. In verse 9, he talks about those who Jesus came into the world was made through him. Verse 11, and his own people did not receive him, but to all who did receive him. So right here at the beginning, there is this contrast between those who will receive, those who will, and that amounts to, in John's gospel, to receive Christ is to believe in him and to believe his word and to abide in his word. We'll see later John's teaching on what true, genuine belief is. But so right from the start we see that. Now notice also in 1 John. Look at how these come together, for example, in 1 John. you see the themes that are introduced in John's Gospel, how then they're discussed. For example, in this text, he speaks of those who are of the devil. Verse 8, whoever makes a practice of sinning is of the devil, for the devil has been sinning from the beginning. And so he says, and I want to pick up down here, and verse 10, by this it is evident here it is, those who are the children of God and those who are the children of the devil. See, you're either one or the other. So that's the kind of dichotomy, that's the contrast that John keeps making over and over, and it relates to, you see how the other ones come into view, like the love-hate dynamic. So he talks about love for your brother, and then he says, as you continue down below, verse 13, don't be surprised if the world hates you, but you know you've passed out of death into life. See, there's another one of the contrasting pairs, because we love. So you see the love, hate, the life and death, the children of God, children of the devil. You find that over and over as you go through the Johannine literature. And what we're seeing as we go to John's Gospel and we look at the way he presents reality and the way he presents God and who God is in the world and who we are and what is happening in our world, it's often thought of in terms of a cosmic conflict, the cosmic conflict, that the realities that we're seeing in the way Jesus reveals the Father and the way people respond to him, that they extend beyond our material world and encompass these spiritual realities beyond our sight. And you'll see what I mean here in a moment as we proceed. But think of John's Gospel as playing out this cosmic drama. And so the dualistic approach to the world and to what we're reading in his Gospel, it has God, of course, and his Son on one side versus the devil on the others, and those who stand with the devil, the world. And in John's Gospel, the Jews are enemies of God and his Son. And by the Jews, he is referring to the unbelieving Jews, or especially the Jewish leaders. And so you have darkness then and death. You have one side, see, you can line all that up on the one side versus those who stand with God and his Son, those who receive, those who believe on and who abide in the Son, and they do that by receiving his truth or his word, his commandments. And so in contrast to those who are in the world and are of the world and stand with the devil, on this side we have light and life. And that is what we find. That is the kind of that's what we mean when we talk about this dualistic approach we find in John's Gospel. So let me see if I can now pull these out and maybe visually represent this. I was trying to think of or find different ways to represent this, but you can think of John's Gospel as setting up this very stark contrast where you have darkness and death on the one hand, and those who are in the world and remain in the world, and life and light for those who come out of the world and who come to the light and receive the light and walk in the light, as he says in 1 John, and then have life, abundant life in the Son. Now let's go a little further. In this view, Satan is the ruler of this world, Jesus refers to him. So this is why we're setting it up this way, because of the language we find in the Gospel with regard to the devil. He's called the ruler of this world several times in John, or the prince of this world. And we're told that he entered, the devil put it in the heart of Judas to betray Jesus. And there's this ominous moment related to us in the upper room when we're told in verse 27, the devil entered Jesus. And Jesus refers to him as a son of the devil, or Judas as a son of perdition. So you have those who are of the devil, who are influenced by the devil. For example, the Jews that Jesus is arguing with, he has this debate, and he ends up saying to them in John 8:44, you're of your father, the devil, and the lusts of your father, it's your will to do. And then in 1 John 3, we just notice how John talked about those who are, you're either a child of God or you're a child of the devil. And in 1 John 5:19, he says, the whole world lies in the evil one. So there's a sense in which he talks about the world as the realm of the devil or the evil one. Now, contrast that with what we find on the other side. Here we're told we have victory. Jesus does call the devil the ruler of this world, but he says in chapter 12 and verse 31, now is the ruler of this world cast out. Now he's cast out. So when Jesus is about to face the cross, when everyone thinks that the devil is being victorious, it's actually through his suffering on the cross that the devil is going to be defeated. So he talks about his death as bringing judgment to the ruler of this world. And he says that he is come now, the ruler of this world has come, his hour is here. But he says in chapter 14 and verse 30, he has no claim on me. So even though he's inflicting harm to Christ and lying against the truth and is the father of lies and is influencing those who are standing in opposition to Jesus and to those Jesus calls out of the world, we still have the assurance that Christ is in control and Christ is judging and condemning and destroying the works of the devil. You find that in the text in 1 John 3, that he was manifested in verse 8 to destroy the works of the devil. That's the perspective. That's the way John tells us. That's what John tells us Jesus accomplished in his death on the cross and in his resurrection. He was destroying the works of the devil. That's a very important point, and I should have included that over here on this side of the divide as well. But we find it over here in, if you go back over to 1 John 3, the text we looked at a moment ago. And those who stand then with God and with his Son are secure. Jesus says in John 10:27 through 30, they hear my voice. I know them, and they hear my voice, and they follow me, and no one can snatch them out of my hand. Right? And that continues in this motif of victory, continues in an assurance, 1 John 4:4. Greater is he who is in you than he who is in the world. Right? In chapter 5 and verse 18, we know that those who are born of God, the evil one, John says, cannot touch him. Cannot touch him. So again, this is the idea of a security that we have because we're victorious over the world. So that's what Jesus says. Remember in chapter 16:33, a verse we noted earlier, that I have overcome. Be assured. Be of good cheer. See, this should affect our whole outlook, Jesus says, because I have overcome the world. And this is the victory that overcomes the world, our faith. We have victory through believing, through our faith in the work that Christ has done. And so then when we get to the end of Scripture, God uses John to tell us about the fate of the devil and those who stand with the devil. They're cast into the lake of fire, and their torment goes up forever and ever. Whereas those who stand with Christ, with God, and with his Son have the assurance of ultimate victory that's presented in a very dramatic way in Revelation. Going still further with this same model here before us, this is the worldview that John presents. This is his emphasis in the way he's presenting the whole drama that plays out in his gospel. Those who are of the world, he refers over and over. Here's where you have one of the other contrasting pairs of love and hate, because he speaks again and again. It's in John's gospel that we find those who do not stand with God. We're told it's because they hate the light. Notice this is a very important text, this text from chapter 3. So I've got it here. I want to look at it with you here. After we're told about how God loves the world in verse 16 and sent him into the world to save the world. But then notice when we get down to verse 19, and this is judgment, that the light has come into the world and people love the darkness rather than the light because their works were evil. So there's our light-darkness dynamic, right? But then he says that everyone, verse 20, who does wicked things hates the light and does not come to the light lest his works should be exposed. But whoever does what is true comes to the light, so it may be clearly seen that his works have been carried out in God. All right, so that explains then, that is a tremendously important passage for understanding our world and the way that it is. That it's not just that people don't want to believe and that the world is just sort of indifferent and neutral about God and about Christ and about the gospel. No, it's because they hate the light that they won't come to the light, John says. This is John's perspective. And so he talks about, Jesus tells them in that farewell discourse in John 15. Let me pull that text up here. Yep, we got it right here. If the world hates you, know that. Notice how much hate appears again and again in the gospel of love. John is called the apostle of love because of how much he tells us about love. But we said it's presented in terms of this dualism, see, of these contrasts. So it's contrasted with hate. If the world hates you, know that it hated me before it hated you. If you were of the world, see, that's what we noted earlier. You're either of the world or you've come out of the world. The world would love you as its own, but because you're not of the world, that's the other side, I chose you out of the world, therefore the world hates you. And then he'll go on to say then later, in verse 23, whoever hates me, wow, look at this, hates my Father also. Now, in the Synoptics, Jesus will say, if you don't receive me, you don't receive the one who sent me. But here, it's much stronger. If you hate me, you hate God. You hate my Father. And then Jesus talks about how if I had not done, verse 24, the works that no one else did, they would not be guilty of sin, but now they have seen and hated both me and my Father. But the word is written that in their law must be fulfilled. They hated me without a cause. So notice how much hate and love and the world and not of the world, that all comes up again and again in John's gospel. We'll see it again even in Jesus' prayer. Jesus talks about those that whom God had given to him, meaning the disciples, and how the world hated them. And yet on the other side, now we see, though, of course we know that John 3:16, for God so loved the world, that God does love the world, and that love is to be manifested by God's people, but the emphasis in John's gospel is on love for one another, love for those who also come out of the world, who receive him and who abide in him. And so Jesus talks about loving one another. Unlike the Synoptics, there's nothing in John explicitly about loving your enemy or loving those outside of the community of believers. And then you'll find Jesus talking about what I think is one of the most beautiful and stirring passages in the Bible, this text from John 17. Look at that with me here. Let me pull it down. Where in Jesus' prayer, notice he says, we pointed this out earlier in verse 20, I do not ask for these also, but also for those who will believe in me through their word, that they may all be one. And so here he's talking about the unity of the Father and the Son. that they may all be one, just as you, Father, are in me, and I in you, that they also may be in us, so that the world may believe that you've sent me. Now notice this, go down to verse 23, I in them and you in me, that they may be perfectly one, so that the world may know that you sent me and loved them, even as you love me. Father, I desire that they also, whom you have given me, may be with me where I am, to see my glory that you've given me, because you loved me. Notice this, you loved me. He talks about the Father's love for the Son and the Son's love for the Father. And that is only in John's Gospel. It's only John who tells us about how the Father loves the Son and the Son loves the Father. But he says, verse 25, O righteous Father, even though the world does not know them, I know you, and these know that you have sent them, and I made them to know your name, and I will continue to make it known. And here's what I love. This is what I find so powerful, so striking, that the love with which you have loved me may be in them, and I in them. So that love that we find in the Godhead, between the members of the Godhead, we're called to participate in that eternal love. What a beautiful thought. I just praise God that we're invited into the eternal love of the Father and the Son. So look at how John's Gospel sets up this cosmic conflict in terms of those who are of the world and not of the world, in terms of love and hate. Now notice in this dualistic approach, where you have darkness and the light, this is the way John is presenting reality. And on the side of darkness is death versus life. And what we're seeing here, of course, is that there is no middle ground between them. See, a lot of people like to think you can just sort of be comfortable in this gray area where maybe you don't believe in Christ, maybe you aren't actively following Christ, but you don't hate Him. Or maybe you maybe you feel like you're just indifferent to Christ and to the claims of the gospel, and you're not really an enemy of God and of the people of God and the Son of God. You're not standing with them, but you're not against them. Well, we know in the Synoptics, Jesus said that neutrality is impossible. If you're not for me, you're against me. He who is not with me is against me. But we find that presented in a very stark way in John's Gospel in terms of these categories, these contrasts that have no middle ground between them, so that even though most people would like to think that they're probably in that middle category, that even if they're not devout, say devout Bible believers and churchgoers and active worshipers, that they're sort of can sort of be in between. Well, I think John wants us to see that you do not have that option. That is not an option that is presented to us, that we have to make a decision. Now, the good news is that you can, and this is what John wants in presenting things this way, this is his ultimate aim, to bring you from darkness to come to the light, and to have then on this side then what? Light and life and love and truth, all of these things. You see the beauty of it all the more in terms of the contrasts by which he presents it. So look at how that is presented to us, that choice is presented to us, or that plea, if you will, by Jesus at the end of his presentation of himself to the world. When you have the book of signs closing up, and then there's this shift where Jesus now withdraws from the world and is presenting himself now just to his disciples. And so at the end of his public presentation to the world, what is the plea that he makes? He refers to being lifted up. He refers to his death, and when I am lifted up from the earth, See, through his suffering, through his death, he will draw all people to himself. That is, through the love that he manifests in his dying on the cross. For God so loved the world, he gave his Son. And that draws people then. See, that draws us toward him out of the darkness and into the light, right? So let's continue on. So he said this to show by what kind of death he was going to die. And so the crowd answered him, well, we've heard from the law that the Christ remains forever. So he says, how can you say that the Son of Man must be lifted up? Who is this Son of Man? But now here it is. Jesus said to them, the light is among you for a little longer. So there it is. Jesus is the light, right? John 8:12, he's the light of the world. Walk while you have the light, lest the darkness overtake you. The one who walks in darkness does not know where he is going. So while you have the light, notice that you're either of the darkness or a son of the darkness, or you're a son of light. So he says, while you have the light, believe in the light that you might become sons of the light. So we need to become followers of Christ. We need to follow him so that we can be in him who is the light, so that we can be in the light. We do that through believing in him and abiding in him in his word. That's how John presents that. But we're called then out of the light and from the darkness, and we're warned that we need to do that while we have the opportunity, or darkness can overtake us. So you see how that becomes very powerful to have this choice presented to us in terms of one of these Johannine dualisms, in terms of this contrast. So as we close, we'll be coming back to some of those contrasting pairs to look at John's theology, to look at these themes a little bit more closely, and others as well as we continue. But when you look at John's gospel here and how different it is in the way it presents to us the work that God is doing in the person and in the life and in the death and in the resurrection of Christ, that it really is presented to us in terms, the narrative is showing us this cosmic drama and how it's playing out, and how we are in the middle of that, and we are called to make a decision based on this cosmic drama, and we're assured of how it is going to end up. We're assured of where history is going and of the victory of God and his Son and his people, and so we're called to share in that by coming out of the darkness and coming to the light and believing on and abiding in the Son. All right, well, I made it through without accidentally erasing all of the audio like I did before. Sweet mercy. I'm thankful. And I'm glad we could be together for class and look forward to being together again, Lord willing. And until then, may the Lord bless you and keep you.